Right, so here's something almost poetic about watching an empire trip over its own propaganda. One day, the tangerine tyrant Donald Trump is thumping the lectern, bragging that he's unleashed the CIA on Venezuela to stop the narco-terrorists. The next, the head of the entire US Southern Command quietly walks out the door, leaving the mission without a commander and the White House without a fig leaf. This was supposed to be Washington's new moral crusade, wasn't it? The war on drugs, reborn in the Caribbean, with B-52 bombers flying overhead and playing the role of border police. Instead, it's turned into a geopolitical farce. Civilian deaths, an illegal covert war, and now open dissent inside the Pentagon over it. The mask has slipped. The war on drugs has become a war on credibility. Emperor Trump doesn't have any. And it's all blown up in his face hilariously when even the Empire's own generals don't seem willing to fight this story anymore. Right, so on the 15th of October, the sociopathic Satsuma that passes himself off as President of the United States, Donald Trump, confirmed that he'd authorized the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, to carry out covert operations inside Venezuela. He claimed the move was part of a new war on narco-terrorism, accusing the Venezuelan government of emptying its prisons into the United States. For anyone else, this would be an extraordinary admission, wouldn't it? A sitting president acknowledging an illegal intelligence operation on the territory of another sovereign state, but this is Trump, isn't it? Nothing ever seems to surprise us anymore, really, does it? The statement detonated across diplomatic circles, though, as inevitably it was going to. Under Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter, states are prohibited from using force or coercion against the territorial integrity or political independence of another nation. But what are the chances of them enforcing any of it? Nevertheless, within hours, Venezuela's foreign ministry denounced Trump's comments as a flagrant breach of international law, which, of course, they are, and lodged a formal complaint with the UN Security Council. The complaint cited both Article 2.4 and Article 51, arguing that the United States had committed a violation of sovereignty under the cover of narcotics enforcement. Upon meeting the Security Council, well, he voiced concern about it, but yeah, go get him, guys. The announcement came amid a series of violent incidents already under investigation, of course. In the days leading up to Trump's confirmation, US military aircraft and naval assets had carried out multiple strikes on small vessels in the southern Caribbean. Washington claimed the targets were drug-smuggling boats. Caracas reported at least 27 fatalities. No narcotics were seized or presented as evidence. Funny that. The Pentagon described the operations as interdictions. The Venezuelan government called them extrajudicial killings. For Caracas, the escalation was unmistakable. They've had years of sanctions and economic sabotage, and this is now being followed by direct military aggression against them. Since 2017, sweeping US financial restrictions have paralysed the Venezuelan economy, cutting gross domestic product by roughly 75%. Imports of food and medical supplies and fuel collapsed. In the vacuum, informal trading networks and smuggling syndicates took hold. And now those same survival mechanisms are being cited by Washington as proof of organised crime. Well, if you cripple a state economically sufficiently and their efforts to fight said crime diminish, it all becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy to a degree, doesn't it? But I'll come back to the drugs cartel picture of Venezuela in a moment. Hours after Trump's admission, though, the United States Air Force deployed two B-52 Stratofortress bombers from Barksdale Air Force Base to fly a 2-hour mission off the Venezuelan coast. The aircraft remained technically in international airspace, but came within 40 nautical miles of Venezuelan territory, close enough to trigger a national alert. Venezuela deployed several F-16s. The bombers are nuclear capable and have no credible counter-narcotics role at all. They're not the right aircraft for such a task. It's overkill, isn't it? Sending massive bombers after fishing boats or looking out for them. The flights were not policing, it was blatant intimidation. That evening, President Nicolas Maduro appeared on Venezuelan TV. He reaffirmed what he called the country's unwavering commitment to peace, sovereignty and dignity, and announced the establishment of new comprehensive defense zones along the border with Colombia, covering the states of Chichira, Apure and Amazonas. These areas, which have long been plagued by paramilitary infiltration, were placed under joint military-civilian control to strengthen mutual territorial defence, to defend both borders, essentially, both sides of the border. So the message was fairly clear, I thought, therefore. Venezuela would not allow another external attack to go unanswered, and it was going to beef up its borders a bit. From the White House's perspective, the entire operation is all being framed as a crackdown on crime, of course, isn't it? Trump's recent claim that Venezuela was exporting criminals to the US echoed talking points he'd used during earlier domestic border disputes. But the US's own data refutes this premise. Trump's lying or just being completely ignorant? Well, surely not. But the Drug Enforcement Administration's 2024 National Drug Threat Assessment attributes about 90% of the cocaine entering the US market to Colombia, not Venezuela. So if Trump wants a war on drugs, he's picking on the wrong country then, isn't he? Well, we already knew that, though. Independent Venezuelan and regional outlets have drawn the same conclusion. Venezuela Analysis and Caracas Chronicles, two outlets with opposing political perspectives, both agree that there's no evidence of a centralised state-directed drug export structure in Venezuela. Corruption and small-scale smuggling are endemic, but the so-called cartel of the suns, as has often been talked about, is largely a myth. It's a convenient label used to smear a government already strangled by sanctions. Even critics of Maduro admit that Washington's narco-state narrative bears no relationship to measurable data. But when's the truth ever stopped Trump and his presidential tracks before? The dissonance between rhetoric and reality was already pretty glaring, therefore, but within 24 hours, it imploded completely. You see, yesterday, the proverbial hit the fan, and it's left Trump up a certain Venezuelan creek without a paddle. You see, the Pentagon announced that Admiral Alvin Halsey, commander of US Southern Command, would retire at the end of the year. Why is this a big problem for Trump, you ask? Well, I shall tell you shortly. But the statement was quite brief, praising his exemplary service and offering no explanation as to why he was going. Halsey has held the post for less than a year. A typical tenure is 3. The timing could not be mistaken for coincidence, therefore. Southern Command is not an ordinary regional office, you see. It is the institutional core of US power projection across the whole of Latin America and the Caribbean. It is basically a viceroyship across the entire area. Established in 1963 as the successor to the old Caribbean Command, it's been the enforcement arm of the Monroe Doctrine ever since, that Latin America is America's playground effectively and everyone else should just butt out. It oversaw the 1989 invasion of Panama, the 1994 intervention in Haiti, and the coordination of Plan Colombia, back when the real source of most of South America's narcotics wasn't an issue because Colombia was an ally of the States. Its intelligence arm, the Joint Interagency Task Force South, is the hub through which Washington manages every counter-narcotics partnership in the hemisphere. Shame if more people became aware of that little nugget of information, given Trump's rhetoric, wouldn't it? When the commander of that institution resigns in the middle of an active operation to crack down on counter-narcotics, as Trump keeps telling us they're up to, barely a year into his tenure at that, it's a little bit more than an administrative turnover. It means something big has gone down. And reports from within the Pentagon suggest internal unease about the civilian death toll from the Caribbean strikes and about the legal mandate for expanded operations. Halsey has issued no personal statement himself. However, according to the New York Times, he had raised concerns about the US military mission in the Caribbean, which has involved a significant build-up of forces and the bombing of 5 boats the Trump administration has claimed, without providing any evidence, were carrying drugs. Therefore, his silence is something you can't exactly argue against. The resignation itself seems to be enough of a message. Until that moment, Trump's government could claim military unity behind the mission. Halsey's exit has torn that apart. The White House could continue to speak of narco-terror and criminal cartels, but the credibility of those claims evaporated the instant the regional commander walked away from his post. That was the moment the facade collapsed. The resignation has reverberated through the hemisphere. Regional leaders interpreted it as the clearest signal yet that Washington's justification had completely fallen apart. For the first time since the 1980s, a head of Southern Command had chosen to leave during an active campaign. Even during the most disastrous US interventions of the past, Panama, Haiti, Iraq, commanders stayed their terms. That pattern has now broken with Alvin Halsey. Venezuela's importance to the United States has never been about cocaine, of course, though. And we all know that, don't we? It's about oil and it's about independence. The Orinoco Belt holds more than 300 billion barrels of proven reserves, the largest on Earth. For Washington, a resource that vast in the hands of a defiant left-wing government has always been intolerable. After the imposition of sanctions in 2017, Venezuela's economy went into freefall. Access to credit markets was cut off, foreign assets were frozen, the state oil company was blacklisted. According to IMF data, national output fell by 3/4 between 2013 and 2023. The formal economy disintegrated, replaced by an informal network of barter, smuggling, and localized corruption. Fuel and food shortages became normal. Regional research institutes have documented how this process created precisely the criminal structures that Washington now uses as justification for intervention. Sanctions forced people into the black market, and the black market became the proof of the criminality. The data leaves no room for confusion. The overwhelming majority of cocaine enters the US market from Colombia, and the flow through Venezuelan territory remains marginal. Yet the country suffering under blockade is the one targeted by bombers and covert action. The policy is not enforcement, it's coercion. Colombia's government has repudiated the US war on drugs model as a failure that destroyed lives and democracies. Mexico is too economically entangled with Washington to serve as a symbolic enemy. Trump's tried that one before with his wall anyhow. Venezuela, already demonized, is a convenient scapegoat though. It's the one place where the United States can still perform power without risking real confrontation, at least until Trump pushed this and see Halsey seemingly walk over it. There's no other obvious reason for Halsey to have quit. This pattern is a familiar one. Every major US intervention of the last half-century began with an overblown pretext. Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, Libya's humanitarian crisis, Syria's democracy, Afghanistan's security. Each justification disintegrated under subsequent scrutiny, though. Venezuela now joins that same lineage, though the excuse this time isn't cutting through. Not if US Southern Command just lost its commander. Legally, the case against the US actions is very straightforward, too. Venezuela has not attacked another state, and no collective defense agreement applies here. The United States has not received Security Council authorization. There is therefore no legal foundation for the use of force. The claim of self-defense does not stand up. The supposed counter-narcotics rationale also fails. There's no evidence of drug seizures or of imminent threat. The US has not provided any. It probably can't. The strikes that killed 27 people took place in international waters and lacked both congressional oversight and judicial review. In the language of international humanitarian law, therefore, they are extrajudicial killings. By contrast, Caracas's creation of comprehensive defence zones along its borders falls squarely within its right to self-defence. The initiative is defensive, publicly announced, and directed towards preserving its territorial integrity. Halsey's resignation confirms what legal analysis was already implying. The mission's foundation is rotten. His withdrawal was a professional act of refusal, a line quietly drawn between duty and complicity. When the commanding officer of the hemisphere's enforcement arm walks away, you're in trouble. The regional reaction was unified and unprecedented as well. Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Chile all condemned the strikes and urged respect for Venezuelan sovereignty. Regional organisations convened emergency meetings to coordinate diplomatic responses. Those governments are not allies of Maduro necessarily, but they all understand the precedent being set. If Washington can strike one Latin American state under false pretenses, it can strike any of them next. And this consensus reflects a profound realignment. The presidents of Colombia, Brazil and Mexico represent a bloc seeking autonomy within multipolar alliances. Their governments maintain growing ties with the likes of China and Russia and the BRICS framework. Instead of isolating Venezuela, the United States has accelerated the very integration it feared. In the US media, the initial framing follows familiar lines, of course. Narcotics and migration and security. Only after Halsey's resignation does skepticism surface, because there's no cover for that. When the Pentagon loses its own commander, even compliant outlets end up asking questions. Across Latin America, independent media was less cautious. Several outlets described the campaign as regime changed repackaged as counter-narcotics. They pointed out that the language of law enforcement was identical to that used to justify coups and invasions throughout the 20th century. They're not wrong either. Any semblance of moral purpose had crumbled away. And so we have a president announcing secret operations in the name of security. Civilians die in unverifiable strikes. Strategic bombers menace foreign shores. The targeted state mobilizes for defense, and then silently the empire's own commander ends up walking away, not wanting anything to do with it seems. Each step exposed the next. The bombers revealed the aggression. The civilian deaths revealed the cost. The resignation revealed the truth. And together they form a chain of collapse of political, legal, and moral standings. Empire fatigue is not merely a metaphor that we're aping about these days. It's an observable process that we're seeing. It begins when the machinery of power can no longer sustain the fiction that drives it. The Southern Command walkout was that moment made visible. Washington depends on the illusion of discipline and unity, and without it, deterrence collapses. Halsey's departure showed that even the military core of US regional power is no longer immune to dissent. The administration can replace an officer, sure, but it can't repair the damage to credibility. The facade hasn't just cracked, it's disintegrated now. Inside Venezuela, the immediate consequence was consolidation. Maduro's government regained a degree of legitimacy as a defender of sovereignty. The new defense zones formalized militia structures and reinforced local authority as well. For the US and for Trump himself, the cost is reputational. The exposure of internal dissent within its own command structure destroyed the narrative of moral clarity. Future interventions dressed in humanitarian or anti-crime language will face immediate skepticism. The precedent is set. Regionally, the attempt to isolate Venezuela backfired. Relations with Colombia improved. Trade routes reopened. Cooperation with Brazil and Mexico deepened. Rather than fragmenting Latin America, Washington has unintentionally strengthened it. Globally, the episode confirmed perceptions of double standards. The same state that claims to defend international law has conducted operations that breach it again, outside of their ongoing and much more publicised conduct regarding Israel and Palestine. Civilian deaths and covert missions contradict the rhetoric of democracy and rule of law. The contradiction is visible to every government that has ever been on the receiving end of US policy. Halsey's resignation is more than a retirement, it marks the moment when obedience met its limit. The act may appear procedural, but within the military hierarchy it's a statement. Not every order can be executed in silence or without consequence. For Latin America, the symbolism is equally powerful. The commander of the same institution that once coordinated coups and interventions has now stepped aside rather than participate in another. That gesture will not be forgotten. It's the quietest form of rebellion, and perhaps it's the most consequential too. Trump's campaign against Venezuela was framed as a war on drugs. In reality, it revealed a disintegration of an imperial system that can no longer conceal its motives. All empires eventually fall, after all. The pattern is a familiar one to us as well. A moral pretext, a show of force follows, there's a human cost, and finally, it all collapses from within. By publicly admitting to CIA operations inside Venezuela, Trump stripped away the layer of plausible deniability that usually protects such actions, because he is that stupid. Taken alongside strikes that killed civilians, that turned his rhetoric into aggression. And by losing his own regional commander within 48 hours, he exposed the internal structure of the very institution meant to uphold US dominance. Venezuela's ordeal is therefore more than just another local conflict. It's a case study in the exhaustion of American power. The same sequence that unfolded in Iraq, in Libya, and Afghanistan is repeating once again, once claimed as Washington's backyard, as this area is. The difference is that this time the rebellion began inside the system itself. The facts are not in dispute. The CIA was authorized to operate on foreign soil without consent. 27 civilians have died in unauthorized strikes. Nuclear-capable bombers have flown off Venezuelan shores. The head of Southern Command has resigned. Each fact is documented. Together they form a record of collapse. Trump's war on drugs in Venezuela has ended where every dishonest crusade always ends, exposed and discredited and stripped of all legitimacy. The claim of fighting crime collapsed under the weight of its own evidence. The rhetoric of liberation was destroyed by civilian deaths, and the illusion of unity was shattered when the commander of the hemisphere's enforcement arm refused to stay in post. The Southern Command walkout will be remembered as the moment the mask slipped. It proved that even within the empire's own institutions, belief in the mission has evaporated. The White House can replace a general, of course it can, but it cannot replace its credibility. The war on drugs died the moment his own commander stopped believing in it, and when the commander walks, the empire confesses. Even more weakness in the empire of Donald Trump got blown open this week as well, and again, US sanctions are at the heart of this story, weakening in effect as they are, because in attempting to crack down on the genius method of evasion that China and Iran have concocted between themselves, the US economy is now taking the hit instead. Well, it is Donald Trump. He does seem to like punching himself in the face like that. So get all the details of that story in this video recommendation here as your suggested next watch. Please also hit like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, so as to ensure you don't miss out on all new daily content, as well as spreading the word and helping to support the channel at the same time, which is very much appreciated. Holding power to account for ordinary working class people, and I will hopefully catch you on the next vid. Cheers, folks.